forget them before the end. So we're already recording, so let's just jump into it. Welcome to tonight's Friends of Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge Spring Gathering. My name is Cindy Skrukrud. I'm on the Friends of Hackmatack Board of Directors, and on behalf of our many board members who are here and might want to introduce themselves in the chat, we want to welcome you to tonight's session. Oh, and then I have a cat that always wants to talk when I'm talking, so good I'm not talking for long. But let's just jump right into our presentations, and then we'll give some announcements about upcoming programs and such at the end of this webinar. So kicking off this bat-filled evening is Dr. Joy O'Keefe, who is an assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist in natural resources and environmental sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Joy studies endangered bats in landscapes where bats intersect with human activity. She grew up in suburbia and got interested in wildlife there, but is interested in conserving wildlife in more wild environments also. Bats are in peril worldwide, so her work helps bats here in the Midwest and everywhere as she identifies strategies to facilitate coexistence of bats and humans. So I'm excited we'll learn more about our local bats and the Midwest Bat Hub from Dr. O'Keefe. So I'm turning it over to her now.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining the call. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to talk about monitoring bats with acoustics. And as Cindy said, I'm with the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I am the director of the Midwest Bat Hub, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the hub. So the hub is part of the North American Bat Monitoring Program, and some of you may have come across information about monitoring bats with acoustics, and that's what I'm going to give you a little overview of tonight. So the North American Bat Monitoring Program is a multi-agency partnership that started up after a series of years of a bunch of bat biologists meeting to discuss how could we better monitor bats and get a better sense of how many bats there are and how bats are doing. So it seems like it's kind of a no-brainer. We need to know how many bats there are, but for a long time we haven't really had the tools to do that, and we still are developing those tools. But this NA Bat program, which started up in 2015, is a multi-agency partnership that tries to provide standardized bat research protocols. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about acoustics, but there are other ways to monitor bats, including by counting bats as they emerge from summer or winter roost sites, or by capturing bats. Of course, not everybody can do all of those things, but it is relatively easy to apply, some of these tools like acoustics and survey bats. So NA Bat has developed a continental bat database, and the idea is that they're going to be the repository for all of these bat monitoring data, whether that be acoustic data or captures or counts. And the team of researchers at NA Bat, which is housed within the U.S. Geological Survey in Fort Collins, Colorado, that team is going to perform annual status and trends analyses for, at the minimum, the imperiled bats in North America. But the idea is to do this for all bat species so that we can track their populations better. So at present, there are a variety of hubs that have been started up to monitor bats according to the NA Bat scheme or protocol. And the Midwest Bat Hub is one of those, and that's the one that I'm directing. There's a Northwest Bat Hub has been around the longest. They actually preceded NA Bat. They were already doing standardized monitoring for bats in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington for many years before this NA Bat program came into existence. And I think our most recent hub that came online is the Southeast Bat Hub. So the Midwest Bat Hub is based at the University of Illinois, and what our goals are is to work within the 8-state region of the hub to facilitate program participation. We work with agency partners such as Wisconsin DNR and Illinois DNR, also organizations like National Park Service or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge managers. And we help to facilitate data collection. So we give advice on, what kind of equipment to purchase. And in some cases, we actually share equipment with volunteers or partners. And we have been helping with data processing and uploading of data. So that acoustic data can be quite bulky. Each file that you record when you're out listening for bats could be 2 megabytes. And in the night, you might get 1,000 of those files. So over the course of a season, we generate terabytes worth of data. And so processing those data does take quite a bit of time. We're doing a little bit of training with folks trying to just kind of standardize some of the procedures that people are using to either collect or upload their data. Some of our partners with agencies actually do some of the uploads and processing themselves, but we also are supported through some grant funds from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help those agency partners. And then we are supporting regional bat conservation efforts by helping with grant writing. For example, last year we helped a tribal organization in Michigan to write a grant to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to gather funds to support their bat monitoring. And as I mentioned, we have some equipment that we are sharing with volunteers and partners, and other resources that we're sharing as well, such as the formats of our volunteer reports. So I'm based in Illinois, and so I have a little bit of an Illinois bias, but what I'll tell you here is important for Wisconsin as well, of course. So we have 13 bat species in the Midwest, and all of these actually occur in Illinois. Now, they do not all occur in Wisconsin, and that's because the diversity of bats in Illinois really is centered around the southern portion of the state, where we have abundant karst. We have a lot of exposed rock, but we also have the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers coming together, and that brings a lot of diversity, including southern species. So, for example, the Rafinesque's big-eared bat, which is the very large-eared bat kind of at the bottom center of the screen, that bat only occurs in far southern Illinois. And then we have the southeastern myotis, which is another species that's only found in far southern Illinois. And the reason for that is that those two species are dependent on bottomland hardwood forests, like cypress forests, which we find in that area. We also have 2 species that occasionally occur in Illinois, which are over on the right side of the screen. So at the bottom is the free-tailed bat, Mexican free-tailed or Brazilian free-tailed bat. You may have come across this bat if you've been traveling to the Southwest. You can see them at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico and at a variety of other spots, including the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, Texas. And this species occurs in the South in colonies numbering in the millions. Here in Illinois, it's only an occasional species right now, but as the climate continues to warm, we do expect to see it move north in Illinois. Probably not during any of our lifetimes will it ever take up residence in Wisconsin, but I could see a future for it there too. The other bat that's an occasional species is the Seminole bat, which is a really pretty bat pictured also on the right side of the screen with kind of a burgundy or mahogany colored fur. And this is a close relative of the eastern red bat, which is pictured right up there at the top of Illinois. So both of these species have really beautiful fur color, and they actually have hairy tails, which you can see on the Seminole bat on the right side. The tail is used to cover up the bat when it's basically roosting in cool places. So we know for red bats, at least, that they sometimes roost on the ground and that they'll wrap their tail around them to use it like a blanket. So in Wisconsin, 2 of our most common species are the eastern red bat, pictured up there right around Winnebago and Boone County in Illinois, and then also the big brown bat, which is pictured at the top left side of the screen. And big brown bats are a common house bat. If you have ever found a bat in your house, it's very likely it is a big brown bat. But the other possible candidate would be the little brown bat, which is at the bottom left corner of the screen. And the little brown bat is more prevalent in Wisconsin than it is as you go further south. So this is a bat that's well adapted to human structures. Bats that we tend to find are bats that historically would have roosted in hollow trees of different sizes and dimensions. We know very little about the natural roosts of little brown bats, but there are a few papers that suggest they roost in woodpecker cavities. So these two bats are bats that have adapted well to using human structures. So let's talk about the threatened and endangered species that are basically kind of the focus of the NA BAT program, and that we're really interested in learning more about status and trends for. So at the top left side of the screen, you have the Indiana bat, Myotis sodalis. That means it's a mouse-eared social bat. And they're so named because when they were discovered in 1928 in southern Indiana in Wyandotte Cave, they were roosting in groups of hundreds of bats, and there were over, many thousands of bats in this cave. And so they were named this social bat, right? And we only knew about their cave dwelling habits when they were listed as federally endangered, even before the Endangered Species Act was signed into law. So back in 1967, they were listed as a candidate species. And as soon as the act was signed, then they were listed as endangered in 1973. So Indiana bats, it turns out, don't just roost in caves, but after they were endangered, we gained the resources to figure out what they do during the summer. And they use dead trees and damaged trees as their roosts. We don't think of Indiana bats as being a resident of Wisconsin. I don't think there's probably been a couple of accidental records there. I did just see that on a map the other day, but it's not a resident of Wisconsin. But we do actually have some Wisconsin bat biologists that come down to help survey Indiana bats in a cave in north central Illinois. So not too far from the border, there is a cave that it's actually a mine that is a hibernation site for that species. The next species that is on the list for endangered is the gray bat. So gray bats in the bottom left side of the screen are a riparian specialist. This is a bat that really loves to forage over water and can actually fly really long distances each night. And it's very much a southern bat. Illinois, we see the northern extent of its summer range being in southern Illinois, but they are found hibernating even further north, interestingly enough, in north central Illinois and also over in northeast Missouri and Hannibal. So gray bats actually use caves as their natural roosts during both summer and winter. So they are incredibly imperiled because of disturbances to caves, because you can actually, have an impact on a significant number of bats if you go into a cave during the winter or the summer and there's gray bats in there. But it's an interesting species that has done pretty well since we figured out that we needed to protect caves. So this species was listed in 1976, and since that time, we've protected a lot of gray bat hibernation sites, and the species has largely recovered. But we were really concerned about impacts to gray bats and Indiana bats from a fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which we discovered in North America back in 2006, 2007 in a cave in Albany, New York. And that fungus causes a disease in bats called white nose syndrome. So what happens is the fungus attacks bats while they're hibernating, grows on their skin and their wings. It was originally seen in pictures on their noses, which is why we call this disease white nose syndrome. But the real impacts are to the wings of bats. The fungus is necrotic on the wing tissue, so it causes damage, but it also is just really irritating, causes bats to wake up numerous times during the winter when they should be in deep torpor, conserving energy. And of course, if there's nothing to eat, then the bats are going to starve if they can't make it through the winter on their fat reserves. So we were really concerned about the impacts to bats that are dependent on caves like gray bats from this disease, which the fungus appears to be a novel invasive species that was brought here from Eurasia. But it turns out gray bats are doing okay. They don't seem to be impacted by this fungus, and that's probably because they spend their lives in caves and thus have adapted to dealing with the types of fungi that grow in caves, and seem to be okay with having something growing on them during the winter and not having that cause too much disturbance. On the other hand, the 3 species on the right side of the screen are all very heavily affected by white nose syndrome, as is the Indiana bat in some places. So top right side of the screen is the northern long-eared bat, which was originally listed as federally threatened in 2015. And this was due to significant declines from white nose syndrome. So the northern long-eared bat used to be one of the most common bats that we captured, including in Wisconsin, but it has become incredibly rare as a result of declines from white nose syndrome. Oddly enough, we rarely saw it in caves and mines when we did winter surveys, but it apparently was there in large numbers because it just disappeared from the landscape after white nose syndrome started to take hold. And it's gotten so rare that the feds have decided to uplist it to federally endangered, and that should take effect here very soon. The bat on the bottom of the screen, the tricolored bat, Perimyotis subflavus, is also a candidate to be listed as federally endangered. And the tricolored bat is an interesting one because it is only dependent on caves during the winter. During the summer, it roosts in the foliage of trees. It gives birth to 2 pups per year, which is also unusual. None of the other bats pictured here do that. And it was always a very common bat pre-white nose syndrome, but it has decreased pretty significantly. I published a paper about declines of bats from white nose syndrome in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and there we saw declines of around 82% in our summer capture rates for tricolored bats. So as I mentioned, it's a candidate for listing as federally endangered, and that decision will be made later this year. The last species I'll mention here is Myotis lucifugus, the little brown bat, which, as I mentioned, is a bat that you can find pretty common in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. This is a bat that people are used to seeing around houses and bat boxes, and historically would have roosted in trees of various sizes. Little brown bats were also one of our more prevalent species, something you would commonly capture if you put a net up over water. This is a bat that tends to hang out in riparian areas, but they have become increasingly rare because of white nose syndrome, and a number of studies have documented significant declines in their summer capture rates as well as in their numbers at hibernation sites. And so they are being considered for federal listing, but they are behind the tricolored bat in this listing status. Now, some other at-risk species I want to mention, which are both very widespread in Wisconsin, are the eastern red bat and the hoary bat. So you'll notice that both of these bats have the genus Laziurus, and as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Seminole bat, Laziurus is the hairy-tailed bats. Now, actually, some scientists have reclassified the hoary bat and given it a new genus, but for ease of reference, I'm just going to continue to use Laziurus here. So they do have a very similar appearance to the eastern red bat, and they are close relatives. These bats are long-distance flyers that do not hibernate in caves or mines, unlike the bats that I showed you on the previous slide. So these 2 species, along with the silver-haired bat, which is another long-distance migrant, will move from more northerly sites to more southerly sites during the fall so that they can overwinter in an area where the climate is more favorable. We don't know much of anything about what the hoary bat does during the winter, but the eastern red bat has been noticed roosting on the ground in the leaf litter in more southern states. And the way this was discovered is that folks were setting prescribed fires during the winter, and they would notice that as the fire started to creep along the leaves, that red bats would fly up out of the leaf litter. And so that was the first clue, which came back in about 1999, that these bats were roosting there. Still, it's very challenging to capture and track these kinds of bats during the winter, and so we don't know very much about their habits. And even the hoary bat, which is the largest bat found in Wisconsin, only weighs typically around 30 grams, and it's only relatively recently that we've been able to put GPS tags on a bat of this size. But even though we can do that now, the GPS tag that we can fit on a hoary bat will still only record for a few nights, and we have to retrieve the bat in order to retrieve the tag. So you have to recapture the same individual, which is challenging when you're talking about a migratory bat. So thus far, we know very little about their migratory movements, but these two species are at risk because the way that we're learning about their migratory movements is that they are often killed at wind turbine sites or wind farms. So as we started about 20 or 23 years ago, we started to put wind farms up in the eastern United States and then expand them in the west to the northwest. We noticed that in addition to passerine birds, that we were also seeing large numbers of bats, especially during the fall and the spring when bats are migrating, and especially on nights after barometric pressure drops and there's low wind speeds. These are times when we see a lot of bats, bat fatalities. And it's giving us our first clue as to the population size of these species, because otherwise that's very difficult to assess since they don't aggregate during the winter. And what we're seeing is that red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haired bats, which are all those long-distance migrants, are being significantly impacted by wind turbines. So while neither of these species is a candidate for listing right now, they are certainly species that we want to keep a close eye on. And that's where the NA BAT program comes in as a way to help monitor their status and distribution. The evening bat is a species that we'll find in parts of Wisconsin. And the big brown bat, as I mentioned, is kind of a common bat house user and also human house user that we will find statewide in Wisconsin. So both of these species seem to be stable or even increasing. There's been some hypotheses that maybe in light of white nose syndrome and declines in some of these other species, that these bats may be becoming more common. But again, it's difficult to track the trends in their populations, and this is where the NA BAT program can play a role. It's also possible that they're just more active in the same airspace where we used to capture the other species, because bats are frankly quite loud when they're out at night, flying around and echolocating. And so I can imagine it would be kind of obnoxious to try to forage in the space where a lot of other bats are foraging. And now some of those spaces are freed up because of the massive declines in some species. So we exploit these echolocation calls that bats are emitting to actually monitor their populations. So we take a bat detector, which is very crudely drawn here. That could be a number of different structures, but they range in size from a credit card to something that's more like the size of a small book. And we are able to passively deploy these, or we can use them in active surveys so that we can record the echolocation calls of bats. And we have a variety of software programs that are pretty good at differentiating the echolocation calls of different species and giving us a sense of who's making the noise. At the very least, we can identify two genus. So we could say these are Myotis bats, these are, maybe the mid-range bats like red bats and tricolored bats. And sometimes we can do a lot better than that. And we're still perfecting this technology. But with bat acoustic monitoring, we certainly can get a sense of who's using the area. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is the way that we've been doing this. And with our hub in particular, and not every hub is doing this to the same extent, but we have been relying on volunteers. And so we are recruiting folks who especially live in the areas that are priority for sampling for the NA BAT program to set bat acoustic monitors out. And this is just an example. You can see 3 different places where folks have deployed bat acoustic monitors. I have no idea how the folks in the middle got theirs up to the middle of that hole, but over on the left side of the screen, you can see one that's on a PVC post and then set on top of a metal stake. And then on the right side of the screen, there's one that's deployed on the edge of a building. So what happens there is the bat detector is deployed. These are weatherproof devices that have an SD card in them or a compact flash card and then some batteries. And they will usually record for between 4 nights and 2 weeks without having to have batteries changed. Depends on what kind of batteries you use and how hungry the device is for power. And then we can pull the cards out of the device, download those to the computer, and then use automated software to identify those bat call files, which can be in the thousands, to either species or phonic group. And by phonic group, I mean like, for example, the myotis, or bats that call in a mid-frequency range. When bats are echolocating, for the most part, their calls are above the range of human hearing. So I don't know if you can see on the slide here, but the bat call that's pictured on the screen there is one that sits right at about 20 kilohertz, which means it's probably a hoary bat call, or it could be a silver-haired bat call, because those are kind of our lowest frequency bats. And then we will get something like this nifty pie chart down below, broken out by species, that can tell us, out of all the calls that were recorded, what was the breakdown. And of course, we can look at that by night, or we can look at that by hour if we want to, and get indications of how bats are using the site. But what NA-BAT is really interested in is the number of files identified per night. And the NA-BAT program really wants to monitor just for a few nights during the summer, particularly during the early summer, like say June. But our hub has been focused on trying to gather data across a longer period of time, because we are interested in what bats are doing in the spring and the fall to get a better sense of the migratory patterns for those long distance migrants. So in Illinois in 2022, we had a pretty productive volunteer monitoring program, and we're extending this year and recruiting more volunteers in places across our hub region. In Illinois, we had 22 volunteers active who monitored 32 squares. The squares are this is the basic monitoring scheme of the NA-BAT program. So each one is a 10 by 10 kilometer cell, and there's a 10 by 10 kilometer cell everywhere, right? Even across Lake Michigan. And what the program did is randomly organize those, and then we have prioritized sampling the top 5% in terms of the list of the order of cells. And so these cells that are pictured on the left side that have a black border are those that are our priority cells. So you can see that some of our volunteers monitored in places that were not priority. But when we are doling out equipment, we are prioritizing giving equipment to folks that are in priority cells, because that random scheme helps us to understand bat distributions better than if we have clumped sampling. Our volunteers recorded between 200 and 445 bat call files per night, and recorded between 3 and 10 bat species per site. So I'll show you a little bit about how those data broke down in terms of bat activity. As I mentioned, we had, ranging from just a couple calls per night to 445 calls per night. The cells that are darker red are the cells where we had more activity. And interestingly, that was often around Chicagoland, but also in areas along major rivers. So we had a site in Northwest Illinois that's along the Mississippi River. Then we have a site along the Illinois River that was pretty productive near the confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi River. And then also along the Kaskaskia River in South Central Illinois, we had a fair amount of activity. And I'll show you just a breakdown for 2 of the bat species that I mentioned, because this is an interesting outcome when we use those automated software programs to identify the bat calls. We get calls identified as Indiana bats on the left side, or as little brown bats on the right side, and they're indicated by their species codes, MISO and MILU. So the Indiana bat shows an interesting pattern where the highest activity rates were along this east-west corridor extending from southern Iowa over to near Springfield, Illinois. And I find that very interesting, but I can't explain it at this point. But it does mesh with the distribution of Indiana bats, because just downstream from Quincy, Illinois, on the Missouri side, there is a major Indiana bat hibernation site that actually has 215,000 Indiana bats in it as of last February. And so it makes sense that those bats would fan out into Western Illinois and would be very active in that region. On the other hand, if we look at the little brown bat over on the right side of the screen, you can see the activity patterns popping up as highest around Chicagoland, also over on the Mississippi River in Northwest Illinois, and then smaller hotspots down along the Illinois River and the Kaskaskia. So this makes sense, and it also gives us a little bit more confidence in the auto IDs of these programs because it's kind of meshing with what we think about for bats that are more adapted to using human-built structures or that are more riparian specialists versus the known distribution of the Indiana bat, kind of meshing with where that big hibernation site is. So I want to just end with pointing out that 2 of our priority cells are right there in the Hackmatack region. So we have 2 priority cells that happen to be right beside each other. And we do have a volunteer who is helping to monitor in the west cell that's pictured here. However, they are only monitoring on the Illinois side, and they are monitoring 2 quadrants of the cell. So I didn't mention, but we do try to monitor in multiple places within a cell. Right now, we don't have anybody lined up to monitor on the cell on the right. And James, who is my hub coordinator, has put some little diamonds on the map to kind of show where places are that are Hackmatack land that maybe could be monitored. But I'm sure you all are way more familiar with that than I am. So I'm happy to link, and I'll put it in the chat after I finish talking, a website where you can look at where our priority cells are, and you can click on and off to see where volunteers have been monitoring in 2022. We haven't started up our 2023 monitoring yet. So with that, I will conclude, and I'll pop my contact info in the chat as well, and I'll just stay online. And after Maggie finishes talking, we can take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. O'Keefe. This is so interesting. Folks, please add your questions to the chat, and I'll ask Maggie to start pulling up her slides while I pull up my little intro for her. So Maggie Zollner has managed natural resources in Illinois and Wisconsin for the past 35 years. She served as director of the Kettle Moraine Land Trust, natural resource manager for DuPage and Lake County Forest Preserve districts, and park manager for the Wisconsin DNR. So she's worked both sides of our Hackmatack state border. Maggie currently spends her time on the board of Friends of Hackmatack and mucking around in marshes and wetlands in southern Wisconsin, working for the Wisconsin NRCS on their wetland easement programs. She's a graduate of University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point with a BS in Natural Resource Management with a soils emphasis. And Maggie's going to tell us about the monitoring she has conducted for bats on Hackmatack refuge lands.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thanks,
and
Maggie.
the presentation, Joy, was great. I learned a lot. I am not in any form or fashion an expert on bats. I'm just a volunteer. And I'm excited to share my experience with you. Some of the information that I had prepared, Joy has already covered, so we may be skipping through a few slides. But this program that I'm involved in is coordinated by the DNR Wisconsin Bat Program. And a lot of the PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing with you was also developed by the DNR staff. And actually the person in the bottom left is Paul White. He's a DNR staff person who works with coordinates a bat monitoring team. And he's holding a eastern red bat that was captured during mistnet surveys in northern Wisconsin. So what we're going to be talking about mostly is the citizen-based acoustic bat survey and a little bit about the bat roost survey. And I just wanted to touch on the agricultural aspect of bats because in Wisconsin, they do save farmers, almost $700 million annually in reduced pesticide costs. And of course, organic farmers are now looking at installing bat structures because they don't have as many options to control their pests on their crops. So they're really important for a lot of different reasons. And Joy talked about all of these. We tend to, as volunteers, to think about two different groups, the tree bats and the cave bats. The tree bats migrate to warmer climates during the winter. And the names can be a little bit misleading because all bats can and will use trees for roosting during the summer. However, tree bats almost never use caves. So I was going to just touch on the species of bats that we found at Turner Track of Hackmatack. And you're probably wondering where Turner Track is, but I will give you, I will show you the location in a little bit. But we did find the big brown bat. It's, as it says, it's state threatened. It roosts in buildings and bat boxes. It hibernates in cold, dry conditions. And we also, oh man, yeah, we found the eastern red bat. Joy's picture was a lot prettier, but it's another one of the species that we found out there, and the hoary bat, which was actually the most common species that we found at Hackmatack. I was going to throw the northern long-eared bat in here because of it being changed to federally endangered. Hopefully that's going to happen, as Joy said, in the near future, hopefully by the end of March. So that'll be good. That'll afford extra protections. So why is the DNR asking citizens to help with bat monitoring? They really want to look at determining the abundance of species nationwide and, or statewide, and why they are trying to gather more data is that, you know, bats are hard to get data on. They fly really fast. They're nocturnal. They tend to congregate together for part of their life cycle. And if there's a catastrophic event, then that can result in the elimination of a large number of bats. And then also the white nose syndrome being a threat to bat species. These are all reasons that the DNR is looking at getting a better handle on what species are here and when they're here. And the wind turbine situation. They have documented that there's something like 12,000 bats per year that, that are being killed on large-scale wind farms across the country. So what we do is we use the echolocation information, and we get that from a regional coordinator. So I don't have that equipment. The equipment costs about somewhere around $4,000. You can see a person there holding a bat detection equipment setup. And she's in a boat. We do in Wisconsin, we can do surveys, driving surveys, walking surveys, and surveys in boats. I have not done a boat survey, but that would be very cool. Let's see. Here is a screenshot of what it looks like when we're out there in the dark looking for bats. So right here is, each one of these is a bat call. And then this is a bat pass. So he's like searching, or she's searching for something to eat, and he's getting closer. And then here, where all these dots are close together, is showing that they captured something and had a meal or a snack. And here's where they're going back to searching again. There'll be like when we're out there looking at the equipment, we don't actually, all we hear is like static. So this would be like, and then it gets faster and faster. And then when you hear all that big scattering of buzzing there above the capture, it's pretty exciting because, you know, it's like like a little entertainment video when you're out there walking around. And as Joy said, there's different frequencies, and the staff at the DNR are the ones that are downloading and analyzing all the data. And of course, one of the best places to find bats is near the water. And so when we're picking our survey routes, a lot of times we're trying to get as close to water as possible. I'm not going to pull this up, but if you are interested in listening to some bat calls, you can go on this website and you can listen to bats in their feeding phase. You can listen to different species of bats calling. And it's a really kind of, you know, nifty little website to utilize if you're interested in that audio recording stuff. So this is what it looks like. That's the bat detector, and this is actually the equipment that is capturing the sound of the bats. Up here is the screen where we're getting those readouts, where we're watching and listening to the static of the bat calls. And then we need a GPS also to track the route that we're taking. And it can actually pinpoint each call. So that's a lot of data. The one that we use is pretty old setup. Like I said, it costs about $4,000 to put one of these together. So the volunteer program, you know, really requires us to coordinate our schedules so that we can get out there 3 times a year. We do, and here's what it looks like on those screens. This is just right here. This one on the left is just your typical, like, that could be gnats out there. It could be, you know, any other kind of insects flying around. But then when you see the markings on the right, that's definitely a bat encounter. So what we do is, going back to this slide, is there's a button on this little PDA, which stands for Personal Data Assistant. I think that's what came out before Blackberries. And you press the save button in the corner. So what we're looking for is a number of calls before you hit a save button. So we have to have at least 2 of these calls before we have enough information for the DNR to be able to interpret what species it could be. And of course, we want to get as much of the call as we can get. And the system, I believe, records for 10 seconds each time we hit the save button. So in one night, we could be hitting the save button, you know, 100 times. And I've had nights where I've gone out and sadly, I did not get to save anything or just 4 or 5 calls. So that's how that works. So here's our bat detectors at Turner Track at Hackmatack. That's me on the left, and Susan Sander on the right, who's another board member, and she's holding our bat detector equipment. So what, you know, how we do this is, first you have to hook up with a regional coordinator who helps keep the equipment maintained, who downloads the data and interfaces with the DNR directly. Then you need to work with the DNR and make sure that the route that you're picking is one that they're interested in. And basically, they're interested in any data that they can get. We want to do monitoring 3 times a year at each site because we're trying to capture, what species are there in the spring, who's there in the summer, and who in the fall. And, bats only, well, they like to fly on nights when there's certain conditions. So we have protocols that we follow. So we have some data sheets that we fill out that record the temperature and the humidity and sunset, because each survey starts a half an hour after sunset or civil twilight. I mean, it's supposed to last for an hour to 3 hours. Most of ours lasted about a little less than an hour because Turner Track is not that big of a site. And it also doesn't have a very good trail system. So it's really difficult to walk around like a restored prairie that's got stumps left over from like some kind of shrub clearing because it's dark. You can't see what you're doing. So you want to be safe. I always take somebody along with me because Hackmatack it's dark out there. And I don't know if it makes a difference for bat monitoring if you do it on a full moon night or not, but it is really nice if you do have at least some moonlight out there. So we begin our surveys a half an hour after sunset, last for an hour. You cannot do surveying in the rain. You cannot do it when it's too windy, like over 30 mile per hour winds, and it has to be above 50 degrees. So I usually get our equipment for about a week so that I can make sure I get the right conditions. Excuse me. And then also sometimes there's data glitches. Like the first time I went out, I believe we didn't have, for some reason, the GPS wasn't working. So we got all these bat calls, but we don't know where the calls were recorded at spatially. One thing that's really nice to have is a red headlamp light. So in case you do need some light, you can use one of the, the red bulb setting, and that won't bother the bats too much. We're always very careful not to drop the equipment. It's old and it's rickety, but it's, you're working in kind of can be difficult conditions. So let's see, here we go. This is what we found at Hackmatack. The axis on the left is number of bat encounters. Those were species calls that could be identified. And the bats detected per hour is more of a relative abundance measure because just because you have 50, you record 50 bat calls doesn't mean that you have 50 different bats. So you can see we had all 3 species in the summer, but only the big brown bat in May and September. So, we're getting better. We kind of modified our route from the May to the July. We found a little bit better route to navigate and capture, cover more ground. So that's good because, like I said, surveys can be 3 hours long. So we give all that information back to the regional coordinator, give the equipment back, the paper forms that we filled out, and then the coordinator does some magic with the data, sends it to the DNR, and then they analyze it, and we get these really cool maps back. So here is Turner Track, and the orange, of course, is our survey route. Obviously, you don't want to double back on your own route, which it kind of looks like we did a little bit. Sometimes when you're out there walking those routes, you have to remember to keep moving because you get caught up in hearing a bat and maybe seeing a bat, and you forget that it's it's kind of like a transect. Your data is not going to be real good if you're just standing in one place all the time. So on the left, the legend, I know it's kind of blurry, but it is grouped by high frequency and low frequency. And so sometimes the DNR can determine the genus, but sometimes they can't, or species. So you can see the brown dots, yellow dots, red, and that corresponds to the different species, which is really nice to see. It also lets us know what the temperatures were. And we only got 2 maps for Turner Track because the GPS didn't work that first day. So the Wisconsin BAT program information all gets put into a database, and this is what the website looks like, just in case this doesn't work. But we will, oh yay, here it goes. Okay, so this website that's managed by the Wisconsin BAT program has land routes and water routes. And I'm gonna pick just the summer of 2022 and scroll in. You can see there's quite a few points, which is exciting. And down here is Turner Track right there. So we're gonna click on that and see what we get. There's a different survey day. So then it brings right up the species, the map. Very cool. Yeah. Oh, I didn't practice how to close this. I'm getting there. Okay. And there are the lake routes are really cool looking. Here's one of a lake route. So, you know, you go in a kayak with somebody else, and I'm guessing this is what lasts 3 hours. So very nice. Okay, so the DNR also does a roost monitoring projects or for citizen scientists. So the goal is to do 1 count in June before the pups fly. And it can be roost, you know, any different kind of roost that are out there. Oops. My timer. So yes, bats do roost in cracks and crevices, and as well as under bridges, in attics, barn, trees, etc. I don't know as much about the roost program, but here is a map of the locations of the roosts by the number of bats that are roosting. Bigger circles, more bats. And it looks like just little brown bat and big brown bat. This is the individual at the DNR who has been helping us with the program. And just a reminder that, you know, bats are facing habitat loss and destruction, extermination by wind farms, pesticide impacts, lack of understanding of the benefits, climate change, and of course the white nose syndrome. The overwintering aspect of the bats, you know, they're picking up, as Joy said, that fungus when they're in these large colonies. And so our suggestions are that the bats need you. You know, put up a bat house 8 feet off the ground, not in a tree, and facing south in full sun, southeast or southwest, and away from other nearby trees and disturbance. You can improve habitats by, you know, leaving snags standing. Wood piles and rock walls might serve as a roost site. Of course, pollinator planting. And anyone can become a trained volunteer. You can do that for the acoustic monitoring or the roost monitoring. And also, if you're not interested in monitoring, but you do come across a bat, whether it's a summer roost site or a winter hibernation site, or unusual behaviors, like sick bats, you know, bats flying in winter, that would be unusual too. So you can contact the DNR and report those. That would be very much appreciated as well. So big thanks to Paul White with the DNR, Melissa and Jay Warner, who are the regional coordinators in our area for the citizen-based science project. Susan Sanders, my pal on the board, and of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for allowing us to do this data collection. And here is your here are your links to get more information about that. So that's it.
Thanks much, Maggie. That was great. Oh, so great. I'm glad Maggie pulled down her slide, but that's good. We'll put that information in the chat, and then when Linda puts this up on our YouTube channel, she'll have all the links that we had both from Joy and Maggie up there. So maybe folks want to turn on your videos now for our Q&A session, just so we can kind of see one another, and so that Joy and Maggie aren't talking to a bunch of black screens. So I thought I'd start off with some questions from the chat, and then people feel free to jump in with your questions. Nancy had a question early on asking about describing techniques. So I think then we went on and she said, oh, you answered my question. We heard about acoustic techniques, both stationary and people walking with them. We heard about roost monitoring. We heard about cave monitoring. So I thought maybe Joy or Maggie, do you want to say anything about, how all these different techniques are used together to get us a better handle on what's happening with different bat species?
Yeah, I can try to tackle that. So we are actually working, and when I say we, I mean the proverbial we, this is a lot of folks, but working to try to bring together various bits of information on bat counts, and that could be counts of bats recorded with acoustics, which, as Maggie said, one bat call doesn't necessarily mean one bat. You could have the same bat circling around your microphone and just record that over and over. So you can't say, well, I had 50 bat calls, that's 50 bats. But if you do see 50 bats fly out of a roost, then you can pretty well say that's 50 bats. And then we have captures as well. So with the NA BAT program, we are working at integrating all of those data together to get a better sense of the status and trends. And that's a ways off because we don't have even sampling across all of these priority cells. But in the future, the vision is that, we will have more acoustics, colony counts, and capture work going on in these various priority cells, or at least a subset of them, so that we can, integrate those data to get a better sense. Bats have different levels of detectability depending on how secretive the species is. And so for some species, it's easier to record their echolocation calls than for others. And for some species, they're easier to capture than others. They're actually pretty darn smart, so they are good at avoiding our mist nets when we net in the same areas repeatedly. So we have to employ a lot of different techniques in order to kind of capture the bats. And it's interesting, Maggie noted that hoary bats are one of the most commonly recorded species, because we're finding that in Illinois as well, which is surprising because it's a species that we rarely capture. That's not too surprising though, because it's a high flyer and it tends to fly above the tree line, probably, and above our nets. So it is necessary to use a variety of methods.
Cool. Well, I had this next question, but kind of the segue about your priority area. So how do you choose your priority areas? Is it just to fit your random scheme, or are there other priorities like riparian areas? And maybe specifically, why the 2 priority cells, they're right in the Hackmatack area? Anything special about them, or are they just random?
They are random. Let me share my screen again and I'll just show the map, which I did link in the chat, but the link didn't work as somebody pointed out. So I also pasted a link for our webpage. But these are the priority cells for the Midwest Bat Hub. If I turn on the entire grid, you can see that these are all of the 10 by 10 kilometer cells in this region. And it's just that of those, we put them all in order. Every cell has a number across the entire continent. And when we take the top 5% of the cells, those are the ones that are green. And by top 5%, I mean the ones with the lowest value of the random ordering scheme. And now if somebody's working, say, on a large tract of land like a national forest, they may have 10 cells that cover their national forest. And in that case, what they would want to do is if say you could only randomly, or you could only sample 2, you would want to pick the 2 cells with the lowest number, which would, get at a random sample of your national forest if you could only sample a small portion of it. But in an ideal world, we'd sample it all, right? But we can't sample it all. So these randomly selected cells allow us to subset. And it does just so happen that those 2 cells there happen to be back to back. You can see around Chicagoland. I was just on a call yesterday with some folks who are going to have me do a program in September for a group out of West Cook County. And I was struck when I was trying to show them this map at how poorly we are sampling Cook County. Now, there is a lot of acoustic monitoring going on in that county, but we're missing it with these random cells. And so there's definitely some deficits here to this random scheme, and we need to augment. And there's no reason why we can't sample other cells, but when we're doling out equipment, we try to prioritize those priority cells.
Great, thank you. That helps a lot. Tom had asked, can our cell phones measure sounds in the frequency ranges associated with bat calls? He's wondering if there's an app in our future.
Yeah, Maggie, have you ever tried the device that clips into the top of your phone?
No, I have not. Do you know what the price range is on those? A couple $100s?
Yeah, it's around $400 now. So maybe we'll be going down in price, but you can buy a device from a company called Wildlife Acoustics, and it's called an echo meter, and it will plug into the top of an iPhone, and I think they have an Android version as well. And then when you buy that device, you actually get their proprietary software, which is similar to the software that we use for our acoustic ID on the computer. And it does in real time process the files and give you an ID. Of course, it's not always going to be accurate, just like you pointed out, Maggie. There's not always, 100% specificity with that, but that does exist, and we are working on improving ID for bat calls.
And just a quick follow-up. While we were listening, I did a quick search. I found something called an ultrasound analyzer for iPhone. It's an app that's $20. Now, I don't know if it's any good, but nice. Anything you could do to kind of enable citizen science here, it seems like would perhaps be a net benefit.
Yeah, so somebody messaged me and said that iPhone device is no longer available, and I'm not sure why that would be, but things are changing, and it may be that they wanted to change their software and change kind of the hardware. Also, it is around $400. You can buy a device called an Audio Moth for only $60, and it is the size of a credit card, and it is a bat acoustic detector. It also records other ultrasounds, so it's just an ultrasound detector. And I'll put a link in the chat for the Audio Moth, but if you had that, you could probably use an app to ID the calls. The deficit with an iPhone or an Android is that in of itself, it doesn't have an ultrasonic microphone. Those have been traditionally kind of hard to come by, but you can plug a microphone into, you can buy ultrasonic microphones that are very nice, that cost in the range of $200 to $400, that you can plug into a tablet or into a phone. So if you had the software, and like I said, we are making Oh, the adapter for the iPhone is no longer available. We are making better software. I just put in a grant proposal for that the other day. So we're, with time, we'll get better at this.
Laura had the next question. Do most monitors work on their own property, or did they volunteer to monitor another site where bats are likely to be nearby? Yeah, I mean, I guess you both can answer that and maybe thinking about specifically in these priority cells. Are you looking for people to monitor on their own property? We have two board members that have said in the chat they live in the easternmost cell and they'd be interested in helping.
Mm-hmm. Well, Maggie, how does it work in Wisconsin with the DNR program that you are getting the detectors from? Are folks monitoring on private land, public land, a little bit of both?
Yes, a little bit of both. I actually monitor on a nature conservancy property that adjoins my house. So I do both my home and the nature conservancy to create a nice route. I also monitor on DNR property at Lulu Lake. There are people who monitor golf courses, which surprisingly they have a large number of bats on some of these golf courses. People, depending on how adventurous you are, some people like the safety factor of doing a park with a trail. And again, golf courses are nice for that. You do have to get permission. I failed to mention that in the presentation. The first thing you need to do is make sure you have permission from the landowner. But my experience with the DNR is that, if you have the equipment and for a week and you want to monitor different sites, then, just go for it. They're not going to, they haven't had so many volunteers that we had to fight over the equipment. It's more like you get it for this week and you got to get it back. So that's my experience.
Awesome. Yeah. In case you all aren't aware, Wisconsin was really visionary in setting up a citizen science or community science monitoring program for bats way back. This happened at least 10 years ago. And the person who kind of was instrumental in that was a guy named Dave Riddell, who used to work for Wisconsin DNR and unfortunately passed away. But he passed the torch on to the staff that are there now, including Paul White and Heather Caraca. And they do a great job of monitoring bats with their own, efforts, and then also have this fantastic citizen science program. And that doesn't just include like the acoustic monitoring, but also monitoring roosts, as Maggie mentioned. So, and they produce a really nice report every year of where everything is. And it's just like no other state is doing anything quite like that, as far as I can tell. So you're lucky to be in Wisconsin if you are a Wisconsinite. And, with regards to our sampling, what we recognize is, of course, much of the land in the Midwest is private, and that's why we went with this volunteer effort. And it panned out pretty well in Illinois in 2022. So we're hoping that we can extend that in the other states in 2023. And some of the volunteers are monitoring sites that, just their own property, but others are monitoring on public lands. And some of our volunteers are actually staff at nature preserves or parks, and they're monitoring their own parcels that they also manage or work at. And then some of those are monitoring multiple parcels. So it can be a mix of both. Sometimes with public land, you need to get a permit in order to sample there. So especially for what we're trying to do is mainly leave the detectors out. We don't do the walking surveys like Maggie does. And so when you leave a detector out, you have to think about obviously the safety of the detector, as well as just, does that park want something to be stationed on a tree or on a post or something? So in that case, it's usually advisable to get a permit or go through whatever the formal procedure is in order to be able to sample those areas. I have a grad student who has done acoustic sampling in parks in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois last summer, and we actually sampled about 45 parks And we worked with the parks districts to get permission. And in one case, we had to just write an email. The other one, we had to actually apply for a permit. And out of all those park surveys, only one time was a detector stolen, which was when it was on a really conspicuous tree that one of the technicians had put it on, and probably hadn't put it quite high enough too. So that's an important consideration as well.
And additionally, along with choosing survey routes, we do try to have the route be by water, because bats, they wake up and they go get a drink and they start feeding over water. But at Turner Track, there are some restored wetlands, but those were the areas that were surrounded by, the cut brush. And Susan and I tried walking through it the first time, and it was pretty hairy out there. So I did do some recon before, it got dark, but never got all the way back there. So then that's why we modified. And you can use, you can go through the woods, especially like if there's a road or a trail. It does make it harder for the bats to fly, but they will use those as routes, as flight routes. So that can work as well.
I think Pete has a question, two questions in the chat. I'm trying to find them here. He was asking about research on white nose syndrome, and just any potential for treatment for white nose syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's challenging because there are a lot of places where bats hibernate, caves and mines during the winter. There are a lot of folks who are working on things that can be applied to bats or that can be applied to cave walls that could help bats to support them. There's also folks working on vaccines for bats to inoculate them against the fungus. Like I said, it's challenging because there's so many places that bats can be, and so many bats are inaccessible. As I mentioned, the northern long-eared bat is a species that we rarely actually observed when doing cave and mine surveys during the winter, but yet it is one of the most affected species, suggesting that it must have been abundant in caves and mines, but per its biology, we think it probably is tucked back into crevices, so difficult to get at them. There's also folks looking at, changing the environment around hibernacula to help bats to put on fat for the winter and therefore to be in better shape to contend with the fungus. And still others are just looking at, how are bats surviving and what are the characteristics of bats that are surviving. And there is some evidence that bats that survive the fungus and that, persist over a period of years have some genetic traits that are unique, and maybe there's signs of hope for the potential for bats to evolve resistance. Bats are a really slow to reproduce species. They're more like humans than they are like mice. So usually these species are just giving birth to one pup per year. And so it's going to be very difficult for them to recover in the short term. But there is already an indication that the species that are surviving have some unique traits. So And we still have bats in Europe where white nose syndrome apparently must have swept through the population, who knows how long ago. We don't see bats being impacted by white nose syndrome, really. They do find the fungus growing on bats in hibernacula there. They're a lot more hands-off than we are, so it took them a while after we detected it to, kind of do a survey and figure out that it was actually abundant in various places throughout Europe, and it's also in Asia. But it doesn't seem to be affecting the bats in the same way, suggesting that these bats have adapted and evolved with this fungus over time and that it was probably introduced here from there. So that gives us some ray of hope for the future. It's just a question of whether or not some of these really imperiled species will be able to pull through.
Joy.
Thank you.
I'm one of those people that lives right, when I looked at your map, I'm right on the line, it seems like, for the two cells. So how will we proceed? Or I did do the online fill in the blanks, but
Oh,
What's
well,
next?
if you went online to our webpage that I linked in the chat, then James will get an email from you, but you can also shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to follow up or make sure that anybody who wants to monitor can. Again, for the priority cell, we might send you a bat detector and ask you to, find places to put it out that are on the refuge for a series of time. We're trying to monitor from April to September, but we're actually just asking volunteers to monitor for, say, 1 week during each month, because we get overwhelmed with data if we do continuous monitoring, even though it's really exciting. So thank you for your
I saw that. That's great. So people are getting connected here. I saw Nancy ask the question, is there a way to support the monitoring programs with donations? She put that question in the chat, and I see Maggie responded that you can donate to the Wisconsin Bat program through the National Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. So that's in the chat. Joy, is there a way to support the broader Midwest Bat Hub?
Not so easily. I would say if you're a Wisconsinite, you should go with Maggie's link and support the Wisconsin Natural Resources Foundation, because you can definitely support that bat program, which, as I mentioned, is awesome. So I would be happy to take money from you and help support our efforts, but it's not easy to donate money to the university, and they're not hearing me say that. So we'll just, give the money to Wisconsin for now.
I've got a question. I know Wisconsin used to be able to take bats and rehab them, but since white nose syndrome, the fungus has really taken off here. Rehabbers aren't accepting bats anymore. Do you know of any wildlife rehabbers that do accept bats?
I don't, but I would also think maybe the first call would be to that DNR contact to let them know the situation, because they'd be interested in, even if it was like some kind of collision, could be white nose syndrome, it could be something else. So I would start with them, and then if there was a rehabber, they would probably know.
Okay.
I know it wouldn't help in Wisconsin or Illinois, but Julie Zeichfuss in Ohio rehabs bats.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it depends on the
one
state.
person who's doing it, but yeah.
It's
Not
actually
useful.
illegal to do it here in Illinois.
Okay.
Wisconsin fellow mortals used to accept them, but they don't anymore. So it's been a little bit of a challenge.
I see. Thanks. Folks are asking questions and answering questions in the chat, so I don't think I have any more questions in the chat. I wanted to say that I'm also seeing lots of, applause and thank yous in the chat for everyone, to Maggie and Joy for these great presentations. I'll open up any more questions from folks.
I have another one for Joy regarding the bat, or the NA bat, how Texas is not on that map, given the amount of bats that they have.
Oh yeah, so even where there are not hubs, there are lots of folks that are monitoring for bats. And one of the outcomes of white nose syndrome has really been remarkable. So I was in the process of getting my PhD back in 2006, 2007 when it was discovered. And I remember going to a meeting in 2008 where the bat biologists from the Northeast came to a meeting with the Southeast, and they said, "You guys, we got this thing. It's pretty bad. It's killing a lot of bats." And we were all, what are you talking about? And now, of course, everybody knows, because white nose syndrome spread down the Appalachian mountain chain. Then it spread west. It spread through Canada. It spread across the United States. It's in, I believe, 38 states and 7 Canadian provinces. And it has changed the face of bat work so dramatically. I could not have been getting my PhD at a more opportune and obviously unfortunate time for bats, because there's just abundant questions and a lot more resources to put towards bats. So almost every state has somebody on staff who is just bats, and that's their job. And obviously Wisconsin's got like the pinnacle of bat program with so many great biologists there. But Texas definitely has people who are working on bats, and they actually just hosted us for the International Bat Meeting in Austin, Texas in August last year.
Any more questions folks have? Okay, well, great. Big hand of applause for our great presenters. We've got a